All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We've got an amazing guest. Before we get started, I'll just talk about how we're going to do this tonight. As we're talking, feel free to put any of your questions in either the chat or the Q&A box. Angela is going to be here helping to moderate that. If you have any issues on the tech side, she'll be able to hopefully help you out with that. And we'll have time at the end for Libby to answer those questions for you. So I am extremely excited to be able to announce Libby Copeland is joining us today. Libby is an award-winning journalist and author from New York who writes about culture and science. As a freelance journalist, she writes for media outlets such as the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Atlantic, and Smithsonian Magazine. Her new book, The Lost Family: How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, was published by Abrams in 2020 and explores the rapidly evolving phenomenon of home DNA testing, its implications for how we think about family and ourselves, and its ramifications for American culture more broadly. The Wall Street Journal says it's a fascinating account of lives dramatically affected by genetic sleuthing. The New York Times says, before you spit in that vial, read that book. And the Washington Post says that it reads like an Agatha Christie mystery and wrestles with some of the biggest questions in life, and was recently named to the Guardian's list of the best books of 2020. And so, Libby, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here, and hi to everyone out there. And Ian and Angela, it's nice to be with you. Thank you.
And I know we've got a pretty wonderful genealogical community here in Fort Collins, and I know we've got some of them here tonight. So thank you all for coming. And I'm just going to go ahead and start. So how did you get interested in this? How did you come to write The Lost Family?
Yeah, so I've been a journalist for a little over 20 years. And stories I always loved to tell were the more intimate stories, ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances. I once did a whole series for the Washington Post when I was a staff reporter there, where I went out at night in Washington, D.C., and I said, you know what, I'm just going to find stories that happen after it's dark. And so I wrote stories from like an all-night laundromat, or the bathroom at a nightclub, so like that kind of stuff I love kind of finding stories that no one else has told. And being a journalist at a major newspaper in a major city means that you wind up doing a lot of stories that are stories where you have to kind of jump through hoops, where you have to get permission from a public relations person to have an hour in a hotel room with Matt Damon to tell Matt Damon's story, and some alternate universe be able to tell some version of his biography that no one's ever told, right? It's kind of silly. And I always wanted to tell the stories like the kind of amazing stories that people had never heard before, from people who they'd never heard of. So, and I have an interest in science, and I have an interest in the cognitive sciences. So like, what forms us? Like, how do we inform our moral compass, our personal narrative? How do we orient ourselves on this earth? How do we form our identities? What do we think about family? How do we decide who we are? And that kind of all came to a head. Those two interests came to a head about 4 years ago. I was talking to my editor at the Washington Post, and we were talking about DNA testing. And recreational DNA testing was kind of becoming hot at the time. It wasn't anywhere near as popular as it is now in terms of actual people who had done it, but it was still like on the rise. And we were starting to hear lots of stories of people who tested for one reason and they found out something really unexpected, right? And we were interested in this kind of like unintentional human experiment that was happening, where like technology was like shaping our most intimate and vulnerable selves, right? So you take a test and you find out, oh my God, I'm not related to the man I consider dad, and he's no longer alive, and I'm in my 60s, and whoa, like what? Wow, what a thing to learn when you took a test just to see like, how Italian you were. Like, what a thing to learn. I wrote about the phenomenon for the Washington Post. I got this outpouring of reader email, like a flood of it from people who wanted to tell me their stories. And I thought, my gosh, this is a book. This needs to be a book. And I wound up feeling like the book was, primarily human beings telling their stories, but it was also this fascinating intersection of science, technology, bioethics, philosophy, questions around the nature of the family, and just sort of all this kind of fascinating human stuff that These stories really live at the nexus of all those fields.
I mean, it's fascinating, just absolutely fascinating. And in the book, you talk about Alice Collins' Plebich?
Yeah, playbook.
Wow.
Yeah, I know it's a hard name to know how to pronounce.
And so, can you talk about kind of how her quest provides this window into home DNA testing?
Yeah. So I knew when I was writing this book, I was like, okay, there needs to be a story that is so compelling you can't put it down, right? And I am a fan of thrillers. I'm a fan of I'm a fan of Agatha Christie. I'm a fan of Tana French, who writes these like detective stories, right? So in fiction, I love a book that refuses to permit me to put it down. And I knew this was obviously not going to be fiction. It was going to be true to life and it was going to be reported stories, but I wanted a story that was so compelling that people would keep, kind of wanting to turn the page, because I knew that there was also going to be some reporting around science and some reporting around the industry and, philosophy and bioethics and stuff like that. And yet I wanted it to be truly mainstream. I didn't want to put off readers who, weren't interested in something more academic. I wanted it to be really accessible. So I felt like if I kind of undergirded the book with a narrative that was really compelling, that would achieve it. And Alice's story, I think, is absolutely extraordinary. It's very, very, very unusual situation of basically a genetic mystery that this woman embarks on that takes her 2.5 years to solve and has a totally unexpected ending. And so I'll just back up and tell you a little bit about Alice. So Alice comes from a large Irish Catholic family. There are 7 Collins siblings. And she takes a test in 2012, which is a long time ago in the context of recreational DNA testing. And recreational DNA, by the way, recreational DNA testing, which probably most people on here already know, is, DNA testing that's not in the context of a doctor's office, right? It's something that is typically kind of framed as entertainment. The idea is that you're going to find out about your family history primarily, right? Your ethnic roots and your shared, relatives in the same database. It's relatively inexpensive, and you can get results back in a few weeks or a month. So it's become like the barrier to entry has become kind of lower and lower with each passing year, and it's become easier and more people do it. Alice was a genealogist. She was looking to break through some brick walls. So she takes a test back in 2012, which is a very long time ago in the context of this technology, but obviously only 8 years ago in real time, which isn't that long. But it's a long time because in many ways this industry was just starting out, and Ancestry, the company that she took a test with, had just actually unveiled their DNA test. It was still in beta testing, so she didn't even know how reliable the results would be. And she's not looking for a surprise, right? She knows who she is. She knows she's Irish American, but she gets one anyway. She learns through the test. It informs her that she's half Ashkenazi Jewish, which is a term for Jews from Eastern and Central Europe who have a unique genetic signature that looks different from someone who has roots in Ireland. And at first she assumes that, the company is doesn't know what they're doing and they're not ready for prime time. And then ultimately takes a test with another company, 23andMe, confirms the results of the first test, and then she realizes that she has a kind of existential mystery on her hands. What's interesting about Alice is she is tireless. Her odds are very, very long. Her trajectory is very, very steep, and most of us honestly would have given up. For a variety of reasons. Her case is incredibly hard to solve, and yet she manages to solve it. And she does it because she's retired, because she has a background in basically data processing, and she has a very analytical mind. So she makes it her full-time job, and she works this mystery every single day, full-time, for 2.5 years. And that's how she figures it out. But I'll just back up and say, her story is not the story of the vast majority of people, right? Most people who take a test and they find out something surprising, it's for one of several very predictable reasons. For instance, they're finding out they're not related to their dad. For instance, they're finding out they're adopted, or they're donor conceived, or they're a product of a relationship that their mom had perhaps outside the marriage, right? Or before she was with their father, the man that they believe is their dad. Or they're finding out that they have genetic roots that were hidden from them because their families decided to assimilate their way out of their genetic roots to escape really bad discrimination, right? And we know those stories in the United States, for instance, with African American communities, where some members were able to pass as white and they chose to pass to escape this rampant racism that they were experiencing. Um, so that is kind of the story of the vast majority of surprise cases, or you're discovering a previously unknown first cousin, or there's some older half sibling that you didn't know existed and you're finding that person in the database, right? These are the majority of the stories that you're hearing. Alice's story is extremely unusual, and it goes back a century. And so part of the magic of getting to write her story was getting to do that historical research for the book. So that's why I think Alice is great. She's unusual, but the reason I like her as a kind of vehicle, in addition to being very compelling, I think, is because every time, so she methodically went through all the theories of what could explain her situation. And every time she explores a new theory, it allows me to peel off and tell another story. And I've corresponded with hundreds of people who've experienced DNA testing surprises, or ways in which DNA testing has really irrevocably altered their lives in really profound ways. And so I get to tell some of the stories in the book. So I get to tell what it is like when you take a test and you discover that you're not related to dad, in a number of different ways, and also from the perspective of the father in some of those stories.
It almost sounds like, to some degree, this is some kind of rewriting the field of genealogy and some of those family trees. Can you talk a little bit about, some of the perceptions people have had and how that's been built, and how it's just spiraled out of control, and even published works about genealogy, have those had to be altered as well?
So, I mean, genealogists have always known that there are non-paternity events, right? And they've been able to trace those. So, not a non-paternity event is like the genealogical term for, like, basically a break in the line where the son or the daughter and the father it's discovered not biologically related to one another, right? And you can find those through the paper record in certain ways. And DNA testing makes that much easier to discover. And it also makes possible certain discoveries that you could literally have never found through the paper record. There's just simply no way that the paper record would have reflected that. So this term, and non-paternity event, or NPE, some people translate it to not parent expected, to be more inclusive, to also represent circumstances in which, for instance, someone discovers that they're adopted and they're not related to both of their parents, right? But typically NPE means the experience of discovering you're not related to your father, the man you believe is your father. And that has trickled down from these narrow confines of the world of genealogy to become, at this point, nearly a mainstream acronym. And I say that because, if you hang out on any of the Facebook groups for people who are using DNA to understand themselves and understand their families, some of which are, more than 100,000 people in them, they are just littered with folks saying, I just discovered I'm an NPE. And in fact, the term NPE becomes a kind of reductive modern form of identity. Like, it is me, I am the non-paternity event, right? And so you have all these people kind of struggling with that revelation. And some of them, yes, some of them are genealogists. Some of them kind of are familiar with the ways that family history can throw surprises. A lot of them are casual consumers. And they went into this because they saw an ad, or they got this as a gift for Christmas, and they had no expectation that this was going to happen. And now they're like, wow. And there's a great kind of mismatch between the investment that they considered themselves to be making at the outset. The test was $69, it was on sale, right? And the profundity of the results that they're getting back.
And so there are, implications beyond just the individual who's getting tested. There's the person getting tested and who they may find or what they may find. And can you talk about the implications for maybe the people who aren't choosing to get tested but are getting wrapped in anyway?
Yeah, I mean, back when I was starting to do reporting for this, which was about 4 years ago, I was talking to a bioethicist, and he told me, increasingly Americans don't get to opt out from this technology, right? It's not really a choice. You take a test, you don't take a test, you're affected by it regardless. And that was at a time when the databases had maybe 8 million people in them. Now there are 37 million DNA test kits sold, and that translates to about 15% of the US adult population having taken a mail-in DNA test kit. And that means that not just 15% of the US population, but the vast majority of us are potentially implicated by this technology. Now, why do I say that? Because you may find out something about yourself or your health or your family, even though you never chose to take a test. And because you are potentially identifiable to somebody who is looking for you, even if you're not in the database. And that's because of the magic of genetic genealogy techniques that have helped people find their birth parents, that have helped law enforcement solve crimes. There's a kind of power to something known as like triangulation, where you can, through, say, a bunch of third cousins or a second cousin or several second cousins, you can do your genealogy back in time, figure out your most recent common ancestors, so your shared ancestors with a cousin or several cousins, and then come back down and do what is sometimes called reverse genealogy, and figure out from public records, from social media, and other sources online, who the potential candidate is of being, let's say, your father, even though he never took a DNA test. And the vast majority of the US population at this point is identifiable through those methods, because they've shown that you are identifiable from a third cousin or closer, potentially identifiable. It's not like snap your fingers, you have to do some work for it. So that means that we've kind of reached a tipping point as a nation, right? Americans have flocked to genealogy and DNA testing, and now we are the population that's sort of at the forefront of like this kind of experiment in privacy and in family history, right? Because we have certain narratives about the way that our families were, or the ways that certain children came into the world, that it turns out are just not true, right? We have stigmas from the past that, we don't necessarily have as strongly now. And yet there's something kind of ineluctable and inevitable. There's a kind of inertia to family secrets. And so they've hung on all these years. And so now you have someone who's, 70 years old or 50 years old, finding out something surprising that their parents never quite managed to tell them the truth about. It never was the right time, or they never could kind of escape the pull of that shame and guilt that they experienced when they made the original decision. So that tipping point is a really big deal, right? And it means that ultimately we're moving towards a more transparent place. And that may be a good thing for many families. It means this kind of moment of intergenerational reckoning, but it's also incredibly painful for a lot of people. And I wanted to look at the 360 of those situations. I wanted to, tell the story of, a donor father discovering that he has 22 donor children from the perspective of him and from the perspective of one of his children. Like, what's it like for him? What's it like for that, donor child that he helped conceive? And then how do they form relationships with all those other people who suddenly come into their lives, right? Or in the case of Alice, I mean, again, as I said earlier, there are 7 Irish Catholic Collins siblings, right? Well, they're not actually wholly Irish Catholic. They are, as far as genetics goes, half Ashkenazi Jewish. And to what degree they each claim that or don't claim that, or feel themselves to be Jewish, or feel themselves to be completely Irish Catholic and only Jewish by kind of an accident that's not very material in their lives, it varies per sibling. And that is an absolutely fascinating thing. So over and over, what you see in what I found in my research and interviews, and what I've tried to kind of get across in the book and in talks like this, is that our responses and how we interpret this information, what we do with it, really varies depending on where you stand in relationship to what's being discovered.
With so many people sort of potentially being surprised by this, what kind of a psychological impact does it have? And how do people cope with the new information and evolve over time?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. When I was starting to do the research on the Lost Family, I didn't know of any psychologists who were specializing in this. And in the last year and a half, there's started to be psychologists who specialize in this. And every single one that I know of who is specializing in this, I think every single one, with the exception of maybe one, came to this because they took a DNA test and discovered they weren't related to their dad, right? So they came to it through personal experience, every single one. That was described to me by those therapists and also just by people to whom it happened who are not therapists as a trauma, right? The discovery that your genetic origins aren't what you thought is a really big deal. It might not seem like a big deal if it hasn't happened to you, but it's a pretty big deal. And it invites a whole lot of kind of reconciliation and reckoning with the past and with the nature of truth and with the nature of trust. So if your parents didn't tell you something that they knew that was material to your own identity, it can make you stop trusting them. It can fray relationships. It can be the sort of thing where all of a sudden you're remembering childhood memories and you're re-editing them and you're actually rethinking the whole course of your life, because once this thing at the beginning of your life changes, it changes the context for the trajectory of everything that follows. So you have people who are, well into middle age, all of a sudden, rethinking the context for their lives. It's a really, really big deal. And they are distraught. They are sometimes, angry. They're often wanting to reach out to their biological relatives, either to just research them or to actually have contact with them. And then the people on the other side have varied reactions. So, the vast majority of people I interviewed who discovered something about their own genetic origins, they experienced it as something very profound, often as a trauma, but they told me ultimately they were glad to know. They said that over and over. I would ask each one of them and they would say, I'm glad to know. Not I'm happy jumping up and down, but like, this is so material to my understanding of myself. I would rather have the truth than like somehow unknow the truth, right? It's not the same on the other side. It's not the same for the genetic father discovering he has a child that he helped conceive 50 years ago and he did not know existed. So a lot of men in those situations tend to shut down. They might feel guilty. They might feel ashamed. They might feel that this is a threat to their families that they had, their nuclear families, their children that they had, with their wives. Their wives may feel threatened by it. And so you see a whole panoply of different reactions. You see men who embrace their children, and I tell some of those stories in the book. You see men who delete their kits and stop, taking calls or responding to letters. You see, I tell a story in the book of a man. There's a really amazing story in the book of a man who his daughter, a woman named Linda, discovers through DNA testing that she is adopted. Nobody told her. And she's in her early 50s when she finds this out. Incidentally, she discovers this shortly after undergoing a radical hysterectomy that it turns out she probably would not have needed and would have known that she wouldn't have needed if she had known that she was adopted, but nobody told her. So there she is in her early 50s, having just undergone this surgery, having just understood that, in fact, the family health history she thought was hers is not hers, and that her mother is not her biological mother, and that her long past father was not her biological father, and that her brothers and her mother, obviously, everyone knew, and nobody told her. And she sets out to find her biological parents. And when she finds her biological father, they have a couple of phone calls, and he eventually says, listen, these phone calls are getting me in trouble with my wife. I don't want you to contact me anymore. And she backs off, but she continues to try to side, he has daughters, they're her half sisters. She continues to try to forge relationships and reach out and make contact, because she's quite, very much wants to be welcomed into the family and to have relationships with her biological family. And ultimately her father has his attorney send her a letter, and it's called a discontinuance of contact letter. And it asks her to please stop reaching out. So, you see the full kind of, scope of reactions depending on, the circumstances, the nature of the secret that was kept, the way that the first overtures are made, this environment in the person's life that nobody could control, all sorts of circumstances that are, largely out of the control of the person who's trying to make contact.
So for people kind of concerned about what other people may discover, has there been organized pushback to home DNA testing? And if so, what does that look like?
That's a great question. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that before. The pushback to DNA testing tends to come from like academic circles. It tends to come from bioethicists who say, hey, hold on a minute. there's a government entity. I think it's a branch of the military, or it might be the military as a whole that's advised its members not to test for privacy reasons. So you see a little bit of that, but not any kind of concerted effort. And I think in some ways, the cat's out of the bag because 37 million people have taken a test. So there's a degree to which you can't kind of back off on that. You can't put that genie back in the bottle. Yeah. And there's a lot of people who find great meaning, myself included, in DNA testing and genealogical research, right? It is this kind of conundrum of, at the one hand, my spit is my spit, right? Why, you can't stop me from spitting in a vial and finding out on 27% this, that, and the other, right? And yet, my spit is also, my brother's spit, like my DNA, I should say, my aunts, my third cousins, right? Every time I take a test, every time I'm in that database, I'm also making a decision in some ways for people who share overlapping genetic segments with me, who may not even know my name because we're distant cousins and they don't know me. And that's the sort of conundrum of DNA.
Now, home DNA testing seems to be, at least as you talk about it, a very, most of people who do it are American. Can you talk about why it's such an American phenomenon?
Yeah, I can talk about that. I mean, the majority of the big companies are founded and based here. And I'll just say that the industry started about 21 years ago. It was started in the U.S. by a company based down in Houston, Texas, which is still around. It's called Family Tree DNA. They sent out their first test kits in April of 2000. So that's exactly 21 years and a day or two. And the other three major companies at this time are Ancestry, 23andMe, and MyHeritage. And all but MyHeritage are based in the US. MyHeritage is based in Israel, but they have an office also here. And, I think part of what appeals to Americans in particular is that most Americans come from someplace else. And in many cases, depending on when you emigrated, your family assimilated their way aggressively, in some cases, assimilated their ways out of their own old identities, right? And they started embracing, Jello molds and tuna salad and like whatever the culture at the time told them what it was to be American, to eat American. And they lost their languages, sometimes their religious tradition, sometimes their foods and that kind of cultural memory. And we happen to be in a moment now where people are kind of looking up and they're saying like, wait, what was my grandmother after all? Like, I'm not even sure where she was from. It's true for a lot of Americans. It's especially true from the research I've seen of a lot of white European Americans, that they don't know where their forebears came from. And at the same time, this coincides with an enormous availability of access to information about where your grandma came from. So, there's literally tens of billions of records available online at places like Ancestry and Family Search and MyHeritage, and Jewish Gen, where you can get you can get records about your family. And DNA testing is bigger and bigger, and the bigger and bigger matters because the more people in database, the easier it is for you to find close cousins and do your genealogical research. There's never been a better time to be a genealogist than right now. There's just a plethora of information. It's completely overwhelming. And then on the other hand, if you're looking at elsewhere, I mean, in Europe, for instance, there are places where people are into DNA testing more than others, but a general attitude, in addition to there being sometimes regulatory barriers, but there's also often in many places a general attitude of like, I know where I come from here, right? And maybe they're not as much of a melting pot, and maybe they're not as heterogeneous. So there's not this question of like, am I French? I'm French, right? And if you've lived in roughly the same kind of geographical area for generations, you're not wondering, where your grandmother's from. So that's sort of like a reason why people outside the U.S. don't always turn to it quite as, quite in quite the numbers that we turn to it.
That makes a lot of sense. And in the U.S. specifically, given America's history of slavery, What kind of implications does home DNA testing have for the African American community?
So the thing about DNA is, you can't use it alone. You have to use it in concert with the paper records. But there are times when the paper records are just going to fail you. Um, and there are communities for whom the paper records tend to fail more often because power, historically power went hand in hand with being written about. So you have to be considered worthy of being written down in the historical record, and you have to be literate, and your records have to be preserved, and all these reasons why, like the victors write history, right? And the same is true for genealogical archives. So like a very stark example of that is African Americans. So if your ancestors were enslaved and you're looking to trace a forebear, and you're following your great great grandmother through time, and you're going back into the 1800s, you're going to slam into a brick wall when you try to get past before 1870 in the federal census, for instance, because before that, people who were enslaved were not named in the federal census. They were just tick marks in a box. So how do you follow your great great grandmother when she just suddenly disappears and like is swallowed up by, this gaping black hole? And that's where DNA can really, really help. So, in the book, I talk about different communities who have used DNA in different ways, and how African Americans in particular have been able to use DNA to, for instance, understand and contextualize oral histories passed down through their family. So, for instance, a story of an ancestor who was owned by a white slave owner and also had a child by that white slave owner. That was a story that was passed down in one family. As a for instance, that story was told, but it had never been confirmed until the genealogist who told me this story did the DNA to prove it, right, and found the white cousin, and explained to the white cousin how they were related, because the white cousin was descended from the white slave owner, and the genealogist in question was descended from the white slave owner and the enslaved woman that he owned. There's a lot of kind of clarity that can be gained from understanding the lives of enslaved ancestors. And there's also a lot that you can learn about the lives of one's ancestors before they were brought over in the slave trade. And so I tell the story in the book of a man who discovers present day cousins in Africa. And through them, he's able to get greater clarity than even a company could give him about, ethnicity estimates, that pie chart that tells you where your people are from anywhere from 500 to 1,000 years ago. Those pie charts are good, but they're not perfect. They're kind of educated guesstimates. And he's able to get somewhere through that pie chart, but then through those present day cousins living in Africa, those folks can give him much more information about his ancestors. And he's able to understand the exact community that one of his ancestors came from. And when he has the name of that community, which is the Fulani people, he's then able to know their language. He's able to understand their foods, their customs, how they traveled, how they live today, right? So what a gift, and something that, again, the paper record would never have given to this genealogist.
Absolutely incredible, just to be able to track that.
Yeah.
And thank you for joining us for the 21st anniversary of home DNA testing. Can you talk about how the industry started?
Yeah, so it started, there's this company, Family Tree DNA, and it didn't exist in the late 90s, but I'll take you back to the late 90s. There's a guy named Bennett Greenspan. He is a serial entrepreneur and a longtime genealogist. And he's in between gigs. He's like recently sold a company, and he is casting about for something to do, and he's essentially getting in his wife's hair. And she says to him, like, you don't need to rearrange the kitchen cupboard one more time. You need to go get a life, basically. And he turns back to genealogy, which was this thing that he would dip into occasionally every once in a while. And then he would hit these brick walls and he would kind of get frustrated and give up and like go do something else, right? So he goes back into his genealogy, and it's not long before he hits another brick wall. And it is this question of this long lost possible cousin living in Argentina. This guy may or may not be related, but they have in common this very unusual surname in their trees. And so he's trying to figure out, is this guy related to me? And he's writing letters to this guy in Argentina, and the guy's writing back, and they're sending documents back and forth. Does this prove it? What about this? How about this old marriage contract? And they can't establish for sure. And this, like a lot of genealogists, Bennett Greenspan is completely obsessive, right? The best genealogists are completely obsessive. You have to be. You have to be willing to just make yourself a detective of history, and just research late into the night and follow that rabbit hole wherever it wants to take you. He gets so obsessed that he decides that what he needs is a DNA test. And but the thing is, they don't sell DNA tests at this time, right? Right? We're about to talk about the guy who invents it. So he calls up. He's read some scientific papers, because at the time, there are scientists who are using DNA testing, looking at the Y chromosome that men inherit from their fathers. They're using that in the lab to study human population genetics. And he finds this paper. He sees the name of a scientist on top of it. He calls the guy on the phone on a Sunday at home. The guy's wife puts him on the phone, and he says, "Hi, I want to buy a DNA test kit from you." And the guy's like, "What are you talking about? We don't sell that. That's not a thing." And apparently the story that Bennett Greenspan tells is that he has this epiphany, because the scientist says to him on the phone, "Somebody ought to start a business, because I get enough of you crazies calling me up asking me for this thing." And Greenspan is the guy for whom the light bulb goes off, and he says, "That's what I'm going to do." And he does. He starts a business. He ropes in the scientist, and they start selling these DNA test kits. But the DNA testing they're doing is different than what's available now. The type of DNA testing that we've been talking about for the last half hour is something called autosomal DNA testing. It gives you, where all your folks came from on your family tree 500 to 1,000 years ago, and it matches you to your relatives, maternal and paternal, in a database. So those are customers who have tested the same company. They match you because the company can detect that you and they share overlapping genetic segments. But the kind of testing that Bennett is offering at the time is different. It's cruder, it's less informative, it's limited to either the matrilineal or the patrilineal lines. It's very limited in terms of the information that you're getting. And it is a completely niche product. And so he says, he goes to genealogy conferences, he's trying to persuade genealogists to buy his product, and he can't. And the first 10 years of the industry is just this very slow progress. And then autosomal DNA comes on the scene. 23andMe comes on the scene with their emphasis on health testing. They also figure out that family history testing and ancestry testing is actually more popular at the time. So they start offering that, and it's a little less controversial for them. And Ancestry comes on the scene. And the big deal is Ancestry is willing to put a lot of money into advertising. They have this subscription-based service where you can access their genealogical archives. And they put those two things together, right? DNA test, and then do your research. And that's a really lucrative model for them. And in 2016 and 2017, they put $100 million into advertising themselves each year. So that is a really big deal, because anyone who was alive in 2016 and 2017 and conscious knows Ancestry's DNA ads. They're so powerful. They can be a little simplistic in terms of the power of DNA and what it can tell you, and occasionally veer off into territory that's smells a little like genetic essentialism and can be kind of troubling. But they're also very, very compelling for a lot of consumers, and they become so DNA tests go from this realm of people like Bennett Greenspan, serious genealogists, into the world of the casual consumer, the person who's like, well, I don't know what to get my daughter for Hanukkah, so I'm gonna get her a DNA test kit, and guess what? That's how I got mine, right? So it becomes the thing that you get for the person in your life, who already has everything, and it becomes just a form of entertainment for America at large.
So where are they going next? Presumably there's going to reach a tipping point where they've tested everyone who wants to get tested. So what's the next steps for 23andMe, for Ancestry?
So that's a good question. So there's been some pretty big money deals recently in this space. So just in the last few months, Ancestry was majority purchased by Blackstone Equity Group. And the deal was valued at, I think, $4.7 billion. And then 23andMe is on the cusp of going public through like a merger with a Richard Branson owned company, and their evaluation is reported to be $3.5 billion. So these are big money deals, right? But what's interesting about them is the story that they tell about the different directions that these industry leaders are going in. 23andMe has basically declared that they see health related testing, which has long been their forte, and always their reason for being from the very beginnings of their founding. They see that as the much more lucrative area to go in. So they're concentrating on things like developing pharmaceuticals. And when you take a test with 23andMe, they give you the option to consent to have your DNA used for research. And they say, well, we will anonymize it, we will aggregate it so that it's not identifiable, but we're going to just like use this to study various conditions. And most people, according to the company, say, yes, you can do that. And that basically is like means that they have like rocket fuel in terms of how quickly they can develop potentially drug solutions to problems, because it takes a lot of time to amass a lot of people for like a health related study in like most other settings, like in a university setting, right? It takes a while to like get your volunteers and get the consent, and then even then their studies just aren't that big. 23andMe has millions and millions and millions of people at this point who've consented. And so they're like, we're going hard on this health trajectory. And Ancestry kind of dabbled in it and in health related testing, and then has backed off. And they're saying they're doubling down on ancestry related testing. So testing for to learn where your people come from and who your relatives are, and expand your tree. So it's going to be interesting to see that question of like who has their finger on the pulse of where the money is to be made, which is ultimately I think what's going to direct traffic in this industry.
And, we couldn't have you here without asking about, some of the cold case murders that have been solved, from, the Golden State Killer, the much publicized, solving from a couple years ago, to even locally here with the Baby Faith case from the 90s. And can you talk a little bit about the ethics, about some of the takes on using family history to solve crimes like these?
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is a really interesting debate. There's always been law enforcement DNA databases, not always, but for decades, and yet they are, and they've solved many, many cases, but they're more limited in part because as they were established, there were privacy concerns around them that were they were established in such a way as to kind of try to protect people's privacy. And the kind of DNA that they use in these law enforcement databases is much more limited. When you are testing to understand, when you're engaging recreational or consumer DNA testing, the kind of information you're getting is very rich and informative. It's extremely telling about who you are, where your people come from, health related issues, like what have you, depending on the company and the particular test that they're offering. And so the kind of the breakthrough in the Golden State Killer case wasn't that you could find someone who wasn't in the database. We've known that for years and years. And people who are adopted have used, some people who have adopted in the community have used DNA tests going back for about a decade to find the identities of the birth parents, because they live in states where their original birth certificates they're not permitted to access them, and they can't know the identities of their birth parents. And that's, so such a kind of block on identity and understanding that they've used DNA to get around that. So what the breakthrough was in the case of the Golden State Killer was not that these techniques existed, but that they were being used in this different context, and that the DNA was so, there's such a wealth of information that you could, through, say, a third cousin or a second cousin or even fourth cousins in some cases, find the identity of a man who was himself never a suspect, never put his DNA into any of law enforcement or a recreational database, and completely was below the radar for decades and decades. And in the case of the Golden State Killer, Joseph James D'Angelo, is responsible for at least 13 homicides and over 50 rapes. So since then, it's been used in many other cases. I think by one estimate, over 200. And most of them are for the more heinous kinds of crimes. So they're mostly for like homicides and sexual assaults. And if you look at the polling among Americans, you see most Americans are okay with this use. They're in favor of it when it's being used in those kinds of crimes. But the question is, there's no regulation at this point around this. So law enforcement agencies all over the country have been kind of doing it the way that they feel is right. And there's no kind of overarching method or rules or guardrails around this. So there have been cases that are considered slippery slope cases where, they involved an assault, but it wasn't a sexual assault, or they involved, abandoned babies, and then abandoned babies who died, and then the mothers were identified through the identification of the babies and later arrested. And you see these big privacy debates around that, around the use of, who's going to say when this is no longer permissible? Who's going to say which cases are okay and which cases aren't? And then there's questions, that are really kind of in the weeds that kind of legal scholars will debate around, like, when does this become like surveillance state stuff? When does this become violations of the spirit of the Fourth Amendment or the letter of the Fourth Amendment? And that is a question that really has not been tested in a court of law. It's just kind of gone forward, and it's been, there have been convictions based on this, and there hasn't been much in the way, I think, aside from maybe one or two cases, there hasn't been defense attorneys who have really robustly tried to attack this method. So there's a question of, like, maybe going forward years down the line, could this be like more heartily tested in, like, I don't know, the Supreme Court? That's kind of a question that potentially awaits us.
Now, moving from that to something a little lighter, have you taken a home DNA test, and have you found anything if you have?
Yeah, I have, and I'll tell you about it. I've taken 3, and you might say, like, why take 3, right? It's just your DNA. DNA doesn't change, but you find different relatives in the different databases, and your ethnicity estimates are not that perfect. They're quite imperfect, in fact. And so they vary from company to company. They're good, but they're not great in many cases. And so I was curious to kind of compare. And we did find long lost relatives through ancestors, through shared ancestors on both my mother's line and my father's line. So second cousins for both my parents, second cousins who are from the old country. In my father's case, Sweden. In my mother's case, Ukraine. These are people, in both cases, they come from lines that we would not have known existed. In other words, paper record wouldn't have revealed it. DNA was the only way we would have found them. So for instance, my mom's grandfather came over from Eastern Europe, and he didn't speak of anyone having left behind anyone. He didn't talk about siblings left behind. He just didn't talk about it. And so my mom grew up not knowing if she had like relatives in Europe, and basically assuming, at least through his line, basically assuming that if anyone was left behind, they either got out or they didn't survive. Through DNA, we learn that there's at least one entire branch of the family that survived in Ukraine as Jews. They survived everything that the 20th century had to throw at Ukrainian Jews, right? And they lived in Ukraine and they lived through the Holocaust, and they survived. And then this man that we connected with moved to Israel and then moved to Brooklyn. And we got on the phone with him, and it was like, poof. So, I'm a person who is, like, on the one hand, like, kind of alive to and aware of all the complications of DNA, right? And all the kind of family questions that it can raise, all the ways in which it can change people's lives in complicated ways. And at the same time, I'm kind of like, wow, we live in an incredible moment, right? You can find out all this stuff. And I think the kind of underlying lesson through all of it, whatever your experience, is the immediacy of the past, right? This moment really drives home the immediacy of the past, the ways in which the past still lives inside of us, still shapes us, whether or not we know it. And we happen to live in a moment where you can actually open up your cells and, like, unfurl the secrets that are curled inside of your cells. And it is like a rocket ship back to the past. And I just think that's like an absolutely remarkable moment that, like, everyone should be talking about right now. I think it's incredible.
I think if anyone was on the fence before, you've certainly helped to sway them in one direction. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to throw it to Angela, who's been monitoring our questions. And so anybody who's attended, if they want to ask any questions in the chat or the Q&A box, feel free, and I'll throw it over to Angela.
Perfect. Thanks, Ian. Thanks again, Libby, for answering all of Ian's great questions. And I've got some more from the audience for you here too. So the first question I have, this individual starts with a story. So I'm going to go ahead and read the story first and then ask the question. I found out my father is not my father, and the father of my biological father notified the family of my biological family notified me, sounded very enthusiastic about meeting, and then I never heard from them again. On top of the shock, the rejection is hurtful. They should have thought about what they wanted to do before contacting me. So do you think at bare minimum, Ancestry, 23andMe, et cetera, should include protocols when a person takes a DNA test in case they get surprises, like how to contact the new family who probably doesn't know anything about it?
I think that would be amazing. Just in the last year or so, the two big companies, first of all, I'm so sorry that happened to you. And you are not alone. And I hope you know that, because that story is an incredibly familiar one, even as it's, very specific to the contours of your life, right? That happens a lot. Some people never get as far as that contact, like they're the one reaching out and they're getting complete silence back, or they're getting some tentative interest and then people back off. In your case, they reached out and then they seem to have gotten cold feet. But the cold feet or the complete closing down is so incredibly common, and it's not easy to not take that personally, because people, you're basically like, it feels like a wholesale rejection of yourself. And of course, they don't know you. They're responding to what seems to them like a threat. And how can that be, right? How can I be a threat? And that is one of the central themes that I explore in the book and in conversations with people, because I get emails like this all the time. And I tried to explain, I have a talk, by the way, if you want to check it out, on Roots Tech, which is a free genealogical conference. And you can just Google like Libby Copeland and Roots Tech. It's like a 20-minute talk. And it's like all about this. It's like why people respond the way they do. And one of the themes of my work is to try to bring kind of like perspective from the older generation, like the adults, like the birth parents, the biological father, why they might react like that, so that we can all kind of like understand each other better, because I think it's important to understand all the perspectives of the triad. Why do people respond like that? But to get to your question, I think only in the last year and a half have the major companies like Ancestry and 23andMe put up resource pages. And I see, thank you, Angela, threw the link to the Roots Tech talk into the chat. So you can open that up in another tab and watch that if you like. That is, it would be great for them to partner more with some of the psychologists who are emerging to help with these situations. There's some mediators who are emerging. So there's a wonderful woman named Brianne Kirkpatrick who runs a group called Watershed DNA. And she's a genetic counselor, and she like mediates family situations, and she has groups of people that she helps online with all these kinds of situations. There's also a lot of free resources on Facebook for people going through these situations. But there's nothing formal, right? There's no it's all grassroots. It's all kind of people coming together and saying there's a need, and the company's not. And they know that this happens. They get these calls to their customer service from people saying, oh my gosh, this is telling me my father's not my father. So they're very familiar with it, and they don't have a lot in the way of offerings. And I think it would be something if they could offer that, or maybe more links to, to people who are offering that sort of thing, if they can't endorse one particular person or company over another. I want to pause and mention before we go to the next question, I have a newsletter, by the way, and I send it out maybe once or twice a month, and I write about family secret DNA, family revelation, the meaning of it all. And so if you want to sign up, I'm going to throw that in the chat. It's at my website, which is libbycopeland.com. And the other thing is that I have there's a bookstore near my house that I'm supporting. one of the things about doing kind of a book tour during the pandemic is you don't get to meet people, you don't get to sign books. So there's a lovely independent bookstore near my house, and they will ship signed, personalized copies of the book all over the country. So if you want like a signed, personalized copy of The Lost Family, they will ship it to you. And I just want to mention that. So I'm also throwing that into the chat. There you go. Okay, thanks. Sorry for the non sequitur.
That's great. Thank you, Libby. I do have one more question from an audience member here. This individual asks, can you comment on the legal issues that come with these surprise genetic findings? I know that you talked about that a little bit after this question was asked, but perhaps you have a little bit more you could share.
Yeah, so there are some legal issues, probably not as many as you might imagine, but certainly in certain circumstances. So from what I understand from having talked to some lawyers, so there's a couple of different buckets. So one is the discovery that you're donor conceived and you didn't know it. And that is an experience a lot of people are having right now because of DNA testing and because they were not told and because of the, the stigmas and the practices of the past. It does not appear that there's like real legal issues for those situations. In other words, a person discovering that they're the product of a donor conception, from what I understand, would not typically be able to lay a claim on the estate of their genetic father. So that's sort of one bucket. But there could be situations, putting donor conceived children aside, and just talking about non-paternity events in general. So discovering you're not genetically related to your dad, and instead there's some stranger who contributed half your genetic material, right? There are situations where potentially there could be legal issues arising from that. And I think, and I'm not a lawyer and I could be getting my terms wrong. It's been a while since I've thought through this, but I did have communication recently with an attorney who told me that in certain circumstances, there could be an issue. And I think it may have to do with situations where the genetic father dies without a will. But I wouldn't want that to mean that's not legal advice because it's like being pulled out of the very back of my brain. But I did write about this a little bit in the book and kind of explored a little of, situations where you might expect that it would be an issue. And for the most part, I don't think it drastically changes the legal landscape, but there are certainly situations where it could be a factor.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
I think that's our last audience question for now. If anyone has any additional questions, though, I think we probably have time for one more. So if you type fast and get it in.
Type so fast.
Libby, I wonder, you talked a little bit about how other countries, we don't see this proliferation of genetic testing in the same way we do here in the US. And I think that you mentioned, in addition to this kind of quintessential US story of not knowing where your roots are, I think you mentioned that particular countries also have
regulatory issues.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So I believe in France, for instance, it is illegal and punishable by a fine to take a home DNA test kit. In Germany, there are kind of cultural reasons why people don't feel comfortable with it. And there are, in general, certain regulatory issues beyond that, but I can't comment too much because most of the reporting I was doing was on the US. Yeah. And we have in the US, by the way, some protections against genetic discrimination. So that would be cases where, for instance, employers or insurers would use your genetic information basically against you to deny you employment or insurance. So there's federal regulation that protects certain things, but it doesn't protect every kind of insurance. So disability, long-term care, life insurance, those things are not protected. And there are theoretical cases, though I don't know of specific ones, where someone could be denied based on the basis of a mail-in spit kit. But again, every person I interviewed could not point to a specific case where it had already happened. So that's kind of an abstract concern. There's a lot of privacy concerns that that have to do with what if, and if they haven't happened, it's somewhat reassuring because it hasn't happened. And on the other hand, it's like, well, we don't know what the future holds. So there's a kind of a tension there in terms of not knowing what we don't know.
Thank you. I'll pass it back over to Ian to close us out here.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us. Just absolutely fascinating subject, and the book is amazing. I'd highly recommend everyone, either check it out or purchase it. Just absolutely wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me, and I really appreciate getting to talk with everyone here. It was really lovely. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Libby.
Okay.
Bye.